This Hong Kong anthology-style horror film, directed by Herman Yaw, reveals the culture and traditions of the Hong Kong people who are closely related to Taoism. The flow of philosophy that studies natural life where human destiny has been outlined by the sky. Humans in the Taoist view must eliminate their desires and follow the natural process. If humans become arrogant and do things beyond their capabilities, then one day he will get reproach that can make him grieve or suffer. It started with one accident case that made the terror spread, and continued until a few days after the incident. Not only one person is haunted, but everyone involved in the deadly accident is also affected. Grandmother Langpo, a Taoist believer, said that in everyday life, people will always encounter problems that cannot be solved instantly. Some people have had bad luck in life. The grandmother warned that if humans use the wrong way in solving life's problems, bad luck will befall others around them. And the movie started. David is a taxi driver who that night was diagnosed with lung cancer. The doctor said that David's age would not last much longer because his illness was discovered too late. Hearing this, David became very frustrated. To relieve his sadness, David drove his taxi, speeding down the road while drinking liquor. He did not accept the bad luck that befell him. Meanwhile, in another place, a beautiful girl attempted suicide on the roof of a building by slashing her own arm. At the same time, Taoist grandmother was on her way home with her two nephews, Asa and Sam, who are police officers as well as husband and wife. Asa looked exhausted from working that night and fell asleep in the car. In the back of Sam and Asa's car, a young man named Patrick is also on his way to pick up his fiancée copyright Yuan, who works as a nurse. Patrick informs that he will be late to pick up that night. Yuan patiently awaited Patrick's arrival while finishing his work at the hospital. The depressed woman who attempted suicide was resurrected after an attempted arm slashing failed to kill her. The woman named Tsai Yu-hung was standing on the roof where she lived planning to jump from the building. Langpo's grandmother suddenly panicked and told Sam to speed up the wheel. Langpo's grandmother shouted loudly for them to leave the road immediately. Elsewhere, an old woman burns offerings to her late ancestors in a narrow alley. A man named King walked in front of the grandmother until suddenly an accident occurred between David, who was drunk while driving, and Sam's car, which was in a hurry to pick up his fiancée copyright. A suicidal Tsai Yu-hung jumped from the roof of the building and fell on Patrick's car, while Patrick's body bounced until it broke the windshield and got into David's car. Sam and Asa got out of the car to report the deadly accident. Langpo's grandmother looked very frightened to see the fateful incident that almost brought bad luck to her life. Not long after, a car passed the scene of the accident. Jeremy, the passenger of the car, came out of the window to record the fateful incident. Sam reported that the incident occurred at the intersection of Sycamore and Maple Roads. Meanwhile, King was angry with the grandmother in the narrow alley for burning the lipstick in the alley. It should be at a crossroads because it is believed that every intersection has a guard. In the morning, Tsai Yu-hung's body was taken to the cremation site to be buried. The man who walked the narrow alley, King, was tasked with carrying Tsai Yu-hung's body to his final resting place. Tsai Yu-hung's family cried sadly because the woman was supposed to be getting married soon. Tsai Yu-hung's mother shouted loudly that she had bought 2 large gold bracelets as her daughter's wedding gift. Before the cremation process, Tsai Yu-hung's body was prepared in a closed room. King, a cash-strapped funeral attendant, chose to steal Tsai Yu-hung's gold bracelet. He removed the 2 bracelets from Tsai Yu-hung's hand while promising to return the bracelet with a bigger bracelet when he got more money. Tsai Yu-hung's 2 wrists were slashed with sharp objects, while King hid the bracelet in his glove and went straight home. Tsai Yu-hung's coffin was finally cremated that day. In the afternoon, after buying food, King walked home as usual. Unfortunately, several thugs of Feng's men confront him to collect a debt that has not been paid for a long time. Kang promised to pay off his debt immediately after selling the gold bracelet from the corpse. Feng said that he would not accept money from stolen corpses because his spirit would haunt him for life. Kang was threatened with death if next week he could not pay off his long arrears. The food that Kang had bought scattered to the ground, which was picked up again to eat that very night. Kang immediately took a picture of the stolen bracelet and placed an ad on the internet. Not long after, a buyer contacted Kang because he was interested in the price offered for 2 gold dragon bracelets. While trying to call the buyer, Kang heard someone knocking on the door. The man peered through the door and a flash of shadow flashed before his eyes. After making sure everything was safe, Kang sat back down in front of his laptop. Instantly, Kang's wrist split open like a sharp cut. The man scratched his own wrist while remembering the body of the woman who owned the dragon gold bracelet. The scar on Kang's wrist disappeared as the phone rang. The prospective buyer of the dragon gold bracelet asked to meet tomorrow. The next morning, Kang rushed off to meet the prospective buyer of the bracelet. Kang waited at the promised place for hours. The prospective buyer's cell phone number suddenly could not be reached. Not long after, a crowd broke out right at the crossroads. Kang approached the crowd where it turned out that a dead man had fallen from the roof of a collapsed concrete building. Kang was suspicious of the man because his features were similar to those of a potential bracelet buyer who was about to meet him. Seeing the man's cell phone lying on the ground switched on, Kang tried to dial the number again. The concrete wall of the building collapsed again on the poor man's body. The ringing of the man's cell phone rang, convincing Kang that the dead man was really the one who wanted to buy the stolen bracelet. Kang hurriedly left the place and went back to his house. Arriving at the door, Zikin was surprised by the red ink staining the terrace of the house. The man slipped as he was about to open the door. Kang hurriedly cleaned himself up while doing the laundry. He realized that the stolen bracelet brought bad luck to his life. Kang went back to pawn the bracelet, but the pawn shop was closed that day. Kang walked back to find another pawn shop that was still open. By chance, Kang met 2 married couples who were members of the Sai Yuhang family. The husband and wife pair are Sai Yuhang's older brother whose wife is pregnant with their first child. As they were crossing the road, suddenly, a large truck hit them and knocked Kang unconscious. The dragon gold bracelet rolled to the ground while the 3 of them were taken to the hospital for medical treatment. After Kang regained consciousness, the police asked who the gold dragon bracelet belonged to. Kang refused to acknowledge the bracelet at all and hurried off. Sai Yuhang's sister's wife reportedly miscarried while her husband died in a truck accident that day. Beside Sai Yuhang's brother's treatment room, lay policewoman Asa, who was accompanied by her husband Sam. It seems that after a fatal nighttime accident 3 weeks ago, Asa suffered from a serious illness that required intensive care in the hospital. Meanwhile, Kang limped into the house hoping his life would improve after handing the bracelet over to the police. The bracelet was mysteriously lying on the table inside Kang's house. Sai Yuhang's ghost appears and starts attacking Kang. At the front door of the house, Feng's thugs who want to collect debts come again. Kang was forced to flee through the window when he ran into Yuan, who was buying flower arrangements to pay her respects to her husband's grave. Kang galloped away from the red ghost and the dragon bracelet disappeared in an instant. The next morning, Kang went to the cemetery to get back to work. Feng's thugs distribute flyers looking for people with ID cards named Chao Kai Kang. Seeing the flyers everywhere, the funeral service owner fired Kang instantly. The unemployed man now does not know where to find the money. Kang went to a gambling establishment and borrowed $100,000 to gamble. That night, Kang felt very lucky that his guess never went wrong. The man got double the money he borrowed from moneylenders. Because he kept winning, Kang bet again with all the money he had. Unfortunately, His last guess was defeated and his gambling money disappeared. Kang walked home empty-handed and the forest grew. The next morning, Yuan paid tribute to the grave of his fiancée Tilda copyright Patrick, who was also killed in a deadly accident that night. Yuan gave her the flower arrangement she bought last night. The young couple was due to get married in a week. The fate of Patrick's life floated right in front of his eyes. After the accident that night, the accident victim was taken to the hospital where Yuan worked. The nurse witnessed her fiancée Tilda copyright test critical condition and was covered in blood. Patrick and Yuan once planned to buy a big house located by the lake. Yuan checked the mansion that no one else had bought yet. Yuan bought the vacation home and opened a lodging business under the name Golden Pond because it was located by the lake. On the first day it opened, Yuan set a price of $600 per night. Before long, the first customers came to the inn. They are a couple named Chung and Peter, who want to settle down in the room. Yuan gave the key to room number 302, which the female customer responded very curtly. That night, Chung closed all the gaps in the doors and windows using insulation and thick duct tape. Chung lit a fire with charcoal so that the oxygen in the room was exhausted. It turns out that Chung is about to commit suicide with his girlfriend, who already has a wife. Peter broke his promise to divorce his legal wife, making Chung angry. After sending a voice message to Peter's wife, Chung sleeps with his sleeping lover. In the morning, Yuan was about to deliver breakfast to the first customer of the inn. Due to no response, Yuan was forced to open the room using a spare key. Peter and Chung had died with blue faces from running out of oxygen. Even the magic charcoal that was burned was completely reduced to ashes. Police officers immediately visited the new inn to conduct a crime scene investigation. The female police officer has now returned to work as usual after being treated for 3 weeks in the hospital due to shock from the deadly accident that night. Asa finds Chung's cell phone, whose last history was sending a suicide voice note to Peter's wife. Asa rushed Yuan and said that the couple who stayed in room 302 died of pure suicide. Yuan burst into tears because the inn that had just opened hers had been hit by a suicide case. Behind the door, a ghostly figure with a horrifying face appears, surprising Isa's husband, who is also a police officer named Sam. After a deadly accident that night, Sam could see spirits and ghosts wandering around. Sam advised the female ghost not to disturb humans, especially the new owner of the inn. Yuan wept bitterly because he was desperate for bank debt to buy the inn. Yuan tried to fulfill Patrick's wish, who dreamed of living in the inn with Yuan. The former nurse resigned from her previous job in order to realize her dream with the late Patrick. Reporters who covered the suicide incident at the Yuan Inn said that the previous owner of the house committed suicide in the room and the house became haunted. Yuan just realized that the inn was sold very cheaply and didn't sell well because there was a ghost. Sam whispered to his wife to take Grandma to the inn for prayer. Asa gave Grandma Langbo's phone number to Yuan while saying that the inn needed an exorcist. That night, Yuan found out the origin of the inn he had just bought on the internet. It turns out that the previous owner was a woman who failed to do plastic surgery named Miss Chan. After his face was crushed, Chan committed suicide in his room by slashing his own wrist. Yuan was getting sadder and didn't know what to do. He even lowered the rent to $500 a night. In front of Patrick's photo, Yuan promised to stick with his new inn business. That night, the second customer came to the inn. The customer was a middle-aged man and woman who were driving the car with Jamie on the night of the accident 3 weeks ago. They rushed in to rent a room for 3 nights. Yuan felt a little relieved because there were still visitors who wanted to stay at his house. Yuan spent the night breathing fresh air by the lake. Suddenly, the woman's scream made Yuan startled in confusion. The second customer ran frantically while saying that the inn was haunted and haunted. Yuan was very annoyed with the ghost in her inn house and rushed up to check. Arriving at room 302, Yuan shouted loudly asking the ghost to come out and appear. Unfortunately, the ghost was reluctant to scare Yuan because Sam had warned him a few days ago. Yuan wept bitterly thinking the ghost was Patrick's spirit who wanted to protect her. The next morning, David, a taxi driver with lung cancer, saw the daily newspaper. In the newspaper it was reported that a haunted inn located on the edge of the lake. From information in the newspaper, David learns that the woman who owns the inn is Patrick's fiancée Tilda Copyright, the man who died in a fatal accident and sped into his car at the time of the incident. At the same time, Yuan again lowered the rental price to $400 a night. Two young men came to stay at the haunted house out of curiosity about the supernatural phenomenon that was widely reported in the mass media. Seeing the news of the awesomeness of the inn, Yuan was very angry and chased the two young magical hunters away. Yuan called the realtor who sold the house while angry because the realtor had never told about the awesomeness of the inn. The realtor actually covered up the previous owner's suicide. Immediately, David paid a visit to Yuan's inn. David asks if Yuan is really Patrick Lung's fiancée Tilda Copyright. Hearing the name of the lover, Yuan immediately burst into tears. David apologized to Yuan because on the night of the accident, he was driving a car while drunk. David admits he was wrong and admits to being the cause of Patrick's death. To make amends, David promised to help Yuan run the inn business without paying a penny. Yuan took David to Patrick's grave to say sorry. David promises to fix Yuan's misfortune after his fiancée Tilda Copyright's death. After packing, David stays in room 201. Yuan insists that David is forbidden to commit suicide at his inn. David promised not to do that in his room. David asked Yuan to call a smart person and clean the negative energy in his inn. Yuan immediately called Grandma Langpo and invited her to come to the inn. That night Langpo's grandmother began to perform an exorcism ritual in the haunted room. Langpo's grandmother had a vision when Miss Chan asked the beauty clinic to take responsibility for her failed plastic surgery. The woman removed the mask in front of the reporters so that the ugly face of her failed operation was exposed and became the monthly month of netizens. Too depressed with the problems that plagued her, Miss Chan chose to end her life. Grandma Langpo absorbed all the energy of sadness and escorted Miss Chan's soul to the gates of the afterlife. Yuan still thought that the ghost in his inn was Patrick's spirit. Langpo's grandmother explained that the ghost in the house was the woman who owned the previous house. Grandma guarantees that the ghost of the woman has gone to the afterlife and will not disturb humans again. Grandma said Yuan's business will grow in the future. Seeing the sad look on Yuan's face, Grandma said that Yuan's fate wasn't too good. Grandmother Langpo suggested that Yuan keep positive thoughts so that positive energy would always enter her house. The next morning, the Yuan Inn had another customer. This time, the man who wanted to stay there was Chai King, an unemployed man who owns a lot of forest and is desperate for his unlucky life. King remembers the threat of Feng's thugs to kill him. The man wrote the last message on the paper and rushed to commit suicide. King wrapped his own head in thick plastic and stuck a gas tube into his mouth. It only took a few minutes for the man to die. In a very late night, David began to suspect because King's room was very quiet as if there was no activity there. David opened the door to the man's room and found King dead. In the morning, Yuan asked David where Chai Feng was because he had not heard any activity in his room since morning. Yuan began to fear that there would be another suicide case. The woman hurriedly went to check King's room but found no one there. David said that King might have left the inn. In the afternoon, a 19-year-old teenager rented a room. That night, Yuan gave him red bean soup while checking and making sure the teenager had not committed suicide. In the late night, Yuan couldn't sleep and heard a thumping sound from the room of Suin-Wan, the teenager who had stayed the night. Yuan ran to check Suin-Wan's room, which turned out to be David also woke up hearing the commotion that night. The man immediately lowered the teenager's body and planned to mutilate the girl's body. Luckily, Soo-in-won regained consciousness and was chased away by David. He asked Soo-in-won to go home because his parents must be waiting. Elsewhere, Sam gives a surprise birthday cake to his beloved wife. Issa seemed happy to receive an unexpected surprise right on his birthday. Sam gave his wife 50 happy birthday cards but only opened them every time it was her birthday. Issa becomes suspicious of her husband's romantic behavior. The policewoman instead accused Sam of having a mistress and was about to leave her. Sam said that he did this romantic thing because he saw a romantic movie and imitated it. The night after Issa fell asleep, Sam tidied up his wife's dressing table and continued to look at his wife, who was sleeping very soundly. The next day, Sam is busy cooking in the kitchen while Issa comes home with a disc player. Not long after, Lang Po's grandmother visited her nephew's house and urged Sam to tell Issa the truth. Sam cried as he said he would be honest with Issa when the time came. The next morning, Yuan heard the news of the death of Soo-in-won, who had jumped from the top of the apartment building. The teenage girl was known to be depressed because she did not qualify for a top university. In the afternoon, residents around the inn found the hand of a man named Kai Keng, whose body was carried away by the river. Policewoman Issa rushed to check on Yuan and David, who were staying at the inn not far from where Kai Keng's body was found. Issa said that Keng's fingerprints were found in the area around the inn. David and Yuan tried to trick the policeman by saying that they had never met or seen the man named Keng. That night, while Issa was dating her husband, Sam saw Keng's spirit walking past the two of them. Sam immediately chases after Keng's spirit and asks what really happened. Sam has a vision the night Keng committed suicide. As it turned out, David found Keng dead in the inn room and hid the body in the room. Keng had written the last will to burn the prayer paper for him. David, who had promised to help Yuan develop the inn business, immediately cleaned up all of Keng's clothes and belongings. The paper and offerings left on the table were burned in David's room right next to Keng's body. David arranged his room with black plastic to mutilate Keng's body. After being cut into several pieces, the man's body was put into a bag, while his blood was collected in a bucket. In the midst of a rainstorm that night, David rushed over to the bridge to dispose of Keng's blood and body. David had prayed to the gods so that the man's spirit would not disturb him. Sam, who knew David's crime, just fell silent and returned with his wife. At the same time, that night Yuan was increasingly frightened by David's movements, which forced him to keep his mouth shut about Keng's whereabouts. After the police arrived at his inn, David explained to Yuan that Keng had committed suicide long before David found the body. David is forced to dismember Keng's body to erase the traces of the suicide at Yuan's inn. This was done solely to help Yuan run the lodging business. Just then Yuan stepped into room 201 to check on David's condition. It turned out that the man had left the inn by leaving a letter for Yuan. The woman reads the contents of David's letter apologizing for being the cause of Patrick's death. David admitted that he regretted his actions because he was drunk while driving. That night David chose to surrender himself to the police and was held in a prison cell. In his cell, David tore his clothes into rags to commit suicide. David tied his neck to the iron pole of the prison cell. Time and time again, David ran so fast that his body was suspended in the air and his neck was entangled in a very tight cloth. On the third attempt, David finally managed to commit suicide, lying down and lifeless. The next morning, Issa, who was at the office, said that Yuan had something to do with the case of David's mutilation of the corpse. Sam, who sat in front of his wife, said that Yuan had absolutely nothing to do with David's crime. Yuan had suffered a lot after her fiancé Tilda copyright test death. Not long after, the antique dealer uncle came to buy Issa's used comics. The man is Uncle Lam, a thrift shop owner, who likes to collect antiques that collectors want. The musical disc from a singer named Jemmy became Uncle Lam's favorite item that was never sold, even though many people had intended to buy it. That afternoon, Uncle Lam listened to Jemmy again with tears of sorrow. Uncle remembered when Jemmy was alive and in his prime. Jemmy is a child raised by Uncle Lam and Aunt King since Jemmy was 3 years old. Seeing Uncle Lam cry while listening to Jemmy's song, Aunt King was sad and stopped the song. Aunt King advised her husband to stop crying and stop mourning Jemmy's departure. Aunt King even threatened to throw away the disc if Uncle Lam kept crying. The next morning, Asa bought a cassette tape at Aunt King's second-hand shop. Asa took Jemmy's disc without Aunt King knowing. In the evening, Asa plays Jemmy's album and dances with Sam. At the same time, Uncle Lam is furious when he finds out that Jemmy's disc has disappeared. Aunt King said that she had thrown away the disc because she couldn't bear to see her husband cry every day. Uncle Lam grew angry and kicked Aunt King out of the house. Aunt King cried being kicked out of her husband's own house. He didn't think that Uncle Lam could be like that to him just because of the music played. In the late night, Sam seemed to sleep soundly, hugging the body of his beloved wife. Sam woke up hearing the bedroom door open by itself. Jemmy's spirit appeared in their house waving. The musical disc of Jemmy's song also lit up by itself. As he woke up hearing loud music in his house, Sam rushed out of his room and saw Jemmy's head pressed against the music player. Sam immediately wrapped the music disc and threw it in the trash in front of the house. The next morning, Asa was surprised to wake up and made Sam run out of the bathroom. Turns out, Jemmy's album disc was mysteriously inside their house. They checked the front door, which turned out to be unlocked. The security guard checked Asa's house because he had not locked the door since last night. Asa dragged the security guard of the housing complex and asked if the security guard put the music disc in his room. The security guard asked him why he did all that. Asa chased away the complex security guard while giving him a musical disc. However, because the security guard did not have a music player, the security guard refused. Sam and Asa threw the music disc into a landfill located quite far from their house. That night, suddenly Asa woke up in a sleep state. Even though her eyes were open, the woman was still asleep and didn't know what she was doing. Asa's body contorted like a snake and crawled towards the trash. Asa took Jemmy's music disc among the piles of trash and brought it back into the house. In the morning, Asa again shouted excitedly, making Sam run over from the bathroom. Jemmy's musical disc is back in their room and forces Asa to return it to Aunt King. Arriving at the thrift shop, Asa immediately handed Jemmy's disc to Lam's uncle. The man was overjoyed to have the disc back and went straight to Aunt King to apologize. Aunt King told Uncle Lam to stop crying when he heard Jemmy's song. Uncle Lam promised his wife to be more patient and accept reality. They got back together and entered the shop. Meanwhile, at night, Sam's body is getting weaker. He continued to watch his wife, who was fast asleep. Sam invited Asa to take a short walk outside the house. Sam was about to say goodbye to his beloved wife, but Asa immediately hugged Sam's body very tightly. Asa said he would not be able to live without Sam. Instantly, 2 men guarding the underworld appeared and chased after Sam. The 2 hellish angels pierced Asa's body, scaring the female police officer. Asa chases after her husband, who is about to be taken away by 2 mysterious men. The woman hurriedly pulled out a gun to shoot the 2 hell angels. In tears, Sam explains that he actually died the night of the accident. That night, Jemmy's head pops out of the car window to record the accident. Unexpectedly, a large truck passed from the opposite direction, destroying half of Jemmy's body. The body of the singing girl fell on Sam until the police chief was pierced by a 9-nail. Seeing her husband die in front of her eyes, Asa was in shock until she was unconscious. During the treatment period, Asa was diagnosed with a concussion of the brain and often hallucinates. Asa often talks to himself and still thinks Sam is living with him. Asa cries knowing the fact that her husband is dead. Sam was getting sad to see his wife crying. He asked Asa to smile because Sam wanted to see Asa smile one last time. Sam's spirit was taken away to the afterlife and flew into the sky. Asa pointed a gun at his own head while saying he was going to follow his late husband. Because Asa was on his own on the streets, the woman was immediately arrested by the police. Asa is hospitalized again because his hallucinations have not fully recovered. Langpo's grandmother also visited her beloved nephew at the hospital. Asa saw Sam waving at him and was greeted with a sweet smile. Elsewhere, Yuan still survives in her and while hugging her lover's photo. And the film ends. This film offers many interesting things that can draw a common thread between overlapping events. In terms of story, this film presents the feel of an anthology with the occurrence of a fatal accident as a common thread. Neatly executed and the plot twists are not too predictable. In addition, the title of this film has a touching meaning where the spirits are actually always near loved ones. They continue to pay attention to how there are humans who choose the wrong path to solve life's problems, while some others are persistent against their own fears. Behind all that, it turns out that beliefs and traditions seem to be clues to being safe in life. Thank you and goodbye.